Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, my name is Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you today, Ken?
I'm exceptionally well. Thank you for asking, Rory. And we both hope that you are well. Joining us here for the Counselling Tutor Podcast, you've joined us at episode 244. We got 3 areas that we're going to be discussing today, starting off with our theory and practice, where we have a look at a piece of theory and look at how that present itself in reality in the practice room. And today we're going to be looking at developing your internal supervisor, internal one. So not the external supervisor, you see, but an internal one. We then go into practice partner. So practice partner is our section where we recognize many therapists run a private practice, even full-time, part-time, and it can be quite a lonely road to travel. It can be difficult to get all the information together that one would need. It can be overwhelming. So Rory and I talk about setting up a private practice and kind of all the little pieces that come together. And today we're delving into something that may sound boring, but it is so important. And it is linked into legislation, and it's how we keep, store and manage data that our clients entrust us with. And it keys in, at least here in the United Kingdom and in Europe, into GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation or regime. So we're going to be looking at that. And then we go into Practice Matters. I love Practice Matters, Rory. This is where we look at what we may come across in our day-to-day practice. And we have a Amy Launder, who speaks so often with counselling tutors. She's done so many lectures for our CPD library, and it's an interesting topic today, isn't it? So we're talking about working with guilt, and I think that is a very interesting topic. It's certainly going to show itself a lot in the practice room.
Absolutely.
So you don't want to be missing that one. Guilt, it's one of those emotions, isn't it? It's unacceptable to self when we have that guilt. Oh, I shouldn't be feeling this way. But let's kick us off with that theory to practice, Rory, where we're speaking about developing your internal supervisor. There's an internal supervisor, Rory?
There is an internal supervisor. So anybody who studies counselling or psychotherapy, right from the early, the introduction courses, will soon come to realise that supervision is an integral part of being a therapist. You go every month for a fixed amount of time to see a supervisor and discuss your clinical work. And that acts like a check and balance to make sure that you are working in the best interests of the client, and also that you have somebody who is a critical friend who can maybe guide you onto a different path or to give you some feedback. It's the essential part of being a therapist. It's an ethical imperative, no matter which ethical framework you practice under, and something that I've been undergoing for the last 20 years. So it is a useful and essential part of being a therapist. But sometimes your therapist isn't available. Certainly if you're sat in the therapy room and something happens, you have to make a decision. And that's when you call on something called your internal supervisor. And I found a wonderful quote from Patrick Casement, who's a psychoanalyst, who coined the phrase internal supervisor. And this is from his book, Learning from the Patient, that was published in 1985. And he says, For monitoring the psychotherapy process, I've relied a lot on a clinical discipline I call internal supervision. This is how I have come to monitor my own work and the clinical work of those who present to me in supervision or in clinical seminars. It's an important part of internal supervision is something called trial identifying with the patient. This means putting myself in the position of the patient in order to monitor my own part in the clinical process, considering how they may be experiencing my input into the session. And another part of internal supervision is to look for unconscious prompts from the patient that can help me recognize when a patient is being affected by me in ways I had not meant and not anticipated. And just a footnote to that, Casement uses the term patient because in psychoanalytic therapy, they're sometimes referred to as patient. In counselling, we talk about the clients. And we get a sense from this statement and the idea of an internal supervisor is this is like a little person that sits on your shoulder and ticks away and interrupts you subconsciously and asks you questions and prompts you when you're in the therapy room. It's like an internal therapeutic conscience. And that develops through the arc of your training. You know, for those who are just going into practice, it may be not very well defined, but after a few years, the internal supervisor becomes quite a strong configurative voice within you and is able to kind of think, oh, I wonder if I've just done that and that's why the client's reacted. Or, oh, I've just said that and maybe I should just check on that. And it's very, very useful. And it goes to, it speaks, I think, Ken, to the fact that our supervisor isn't always around. So sometimes as we develop as practitioners, we have to make some calls ourselves, things around confidentiality or interventions we may use in the service of the client.
Wow. It's such an important and interesting topic that you've brought this morning, Rory, and I like that you said that it is dependent on maturity, and you'll find that the more mature you are in your practice, the more you may be able to key into that. And I love the way you voiced it, Rory, that configuration of self, which is another theory. It's those many voices within. You know, it's that part within the session where something clangs, something doesn't feel 100% right, or there may be an area of danger, or there may be a security issue. It's kind of being there with the client 100%, but also part of you overseeing the relationship and having a look at what is going on there. If a client starts speaking about something that may break a confidentiality boundary within your contract, you might be going, what do I need to look out for this? How do I hold this? And it can sound quite, I guess, daunting as we're speaking about it now. As I'm saying it, I'm thinking, wow, that sounds really tricky. But I guess it becomes more and more natural, Rory. It's kind of it's not quite gut, but you might get an indication from your gut to be in that supervisory position within your own practice.
Yeah, I think it's a dual process, Ken. I think you're absolutely right. It is a visceral gut feeling, but I also think it's a cognitive feeling because we're having to draw on ethical frameworks, our theories, our contract. So there is a fair amount of thought process in that. But what's very, very useful with this internal supervisor or developing the internal supervisor is that then gives you food for discussion when you meet your supervisor. So you may write that up in your personal notes, in your personal journal, and then take that to your supervisor and said, you know, when I was working with this client, this happened. This process is what happened. This is where I found myself in. This is what I did. And the supervisor, because they're external to you, can then kind of look at that with you and try and work out what generated the actions you took or the discomfort you felt, or even the uncertainty. I think that, you know, as therapists, sometimes we work with a lot of uncertainty and we have to kind of manage that. So it's a very, very useful process. And I think that supervisors should help actively develop the internal supervisor. I know that I do in my supervisees. I say, what does that tell you? Before I give them an answer or give them an observation, I will ask them, what does that tell you? What do you think's going on for you there? And together we can kind of work it out together. And that then feeds and provides nourishment for the internal supervisor. And it's interesting, I've supervised for many years students who are now, well qualified, well experienced practitioners, and it's noticeable their internal supervisor is very active, very present, and always presents in supervision, as it does in therapy, Ken.
I like it. And, it's about being a reflective and reflexive practitioner. And we've spoken about this before on the podcast. Reflective after the session, thinking about how that went, what came up for you. Was there anything that came up from the client? And this is outside of just keeping the client notes and preparing for your next client. It's really going into that and having a look. And maybe there are natural signs to that internal supervisor. So the client may present with something that you haven't maybe delved deeply into in your own training. And you may afterwards reflect on that and go, you know what, I think I need to maybe go and do a little bit of CPD within that area, maybe read a book or go into something like the Counselor CPD library and go and search that topic and delve deeper. And that is that internal supervisor. It's kind of informing you of what CPD you might do, in the same way as you might go to your supervisor and say, I've got this client, they're presented with this, and the supervisor may say, have you got knowledge and training in that area? If you say no, the supervisor is going to guide you. So there's maybe an example, an active example of that internal supervisor. And I think that you're 100% right, Rory, in saying that if you take this topic to your supervisor and say, how can I develop my internal supervisor? Ask your supervisor, what are the processes that you go through when you're working with me in supervision? And if your supervisor can walk you through that, then you have like a framework to kind of map your internal supervisor to. Now, I know, Rory, we in Counselling Tutor, we offer a clinical supervision training course. And in fact, if you're listening to this in real time, we have our next intake in January 2023. And if you're interested in finding out more about that, go to counsellingtutor.com. Just scroll down on our main page and you'll see our supervision training, and you can join the update list, and we'll send you all the information about that. But within that training, so often we get feedback from those undertaking the training of how it is improving their practice with their clients. Yes, they're learning to be supervisors, but what's happening is they're learning a framework of how supervision works, and then are able to kind of look at themselves in practice. And all it is doing is strengthening that internal supervisor, Rory.
Absolutely, Ken. And I like the term strengthening, because I think it speaks to how we develop as practitioners. And one of the things that comes up a lot, it comes up for me during my years of practice, and it comes up in supervision, is the relationship with the client. I think one of the things the internal supervisor speaks to is when you're working with a client and you may get this sense of, I'm not sure I'm in the relationship here. I'm more outside it. I'm not connecting, and I'm just not feeling it, to be honest. And I think that is the internal supervisor saying, hey, there's something going on here. What the hell's going on with you, as a counsellor? What's going on there? And that's the time to take that to supervision and say, if I was sharing a journey on a train, and there was myself and the client in the train with no stops between Manchester and London, and there's only two of us in the carriage, why would I sit at the opposite end of the train to my client? And it's at that point the supervisor is going to be looking at, who is this client to you? What is the relationship? Is there anything that's brought up from the past? And of course, we're into the realms of my favourite topic, which is transference and counter-transference. And it's all part of being an effective, being an effective practitioner, but it's also being part of an effective supervisee. I don't think there's a lot spoken about how to be a useful and a productive supervisee. We go to supervision. I've never seen anything taught on it, to be honest, apart from the lectures we have in the Counselling Tutor Library, the CSR Library. So it helps you present the material better. The internal supervisor sets you up to be able to go and see a clinical supervisor and say, this is where I am, this is what I'm feeling, what's going on, can we work it out together, Ken?
Yeah. You know what might be handy here, Rory, is if we share the supervision triangle. So the supervision triangle is covered in our supervision training course. And just looking at the areas of the supervision triangle, because as you're kind of talking about what might come up, Rory, I'm kind of mapping it to the supervision triangle. When we were speaking about maybe you recognize that there's an area of CPD that you might need to go and do. What area of the supervision triangle might that fall into, Rory?
Well, I would think that would be the restorative side, where you may want some support. You're if I'm hearing you correctly, Ken, you may be a bit unsure, not feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome. Part of that would be the restorative. In other words, the supervisor would help to kind of find out what's going on for you, try and give you some balance and equilibrium in your practice. And of course, the other two sides of the triangle are it's formative, normative, and restorative. So normative is usually the ethical side of things, and the formative side is usually information and educative process. So within supervision, it kind of ebbs and flows in the supervision session. Sometimes someone comes in for support, and through that arc of normative support, bringing things back to normal, you may need to help with some education, and that would be the formative. Or you may have to look at the ethical framework, and that would be the normative side. So it's really, really important. It really, the internal supervisor in its development helps plug you in to your supervision. I think that's the best way I can do it. You could plug yourself in, download yourself, and then, you and your supervisor can look at what the hell's going on. What's going on? So I say, what's going on? What's going on here? And you can work it out together. It's an essential ingredient. It really is, to be, I think, a competent, caring, and thoughtful practitioner, Ken.
Yeah, and it protects you as well. I mean, you spoke about that restorative quadrant. It's not a quadrant, because that would make it 4, isn't it? It's corner of the triangle. trying to be fancy here. Of the supervision triangle. And it may well be that you're kind of just about to go into a session with a client, and you go, wow, I'm tired, my energy levels are down. And you may then decide, you know what, I think I need to take a break. I think I need a little bit of personal time. Maybe I'm going to go on a retreat, or I'm going to go away for a weekend with a family or something. I'm going to let my clients know that I'm going to be taking a short break. And that's restorative. That's the internal supervisor recognizing, hold on, I'm feeling a little bit tired in this. I'm not able to be there fully. So you probably have that internal supervisor anyway. But there are 2 takeaways from this. Takeaway number 1 is you've got to get Rory's super duper handout on the internal supervisor. And you can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com. That is the main website. That's where it all happens in Counselling Tutor. Click on the podcast tab, go to episode 244. 244, that's today's episode. And right there on that page, you can download your internal supervisor handout. It's free of charge. Just pop in your email address and we will send that to you. Takeaway number 2, if you have a maturity in your practice, so you've practiced for 2 years, and you feel that you are ready to undertake clinical supervision training for your own development, for the development of your internal supervisor, and of course, so that you can be there in service of others and your supervisees who will come to you, then now's a great time to look at that if you consider Counselling Tutor for your studies, because we are about to launch that. January 2023 is our next intake. Our intakes sell out very, very quickly. You can put your name on the waiting list by going to counsellingtutor.com. Just scroll a little bit down on the front page and you'll see the clinical supervision training, and add your name to the update list. We'll send you all the information. In fact, you'll get the training handbook straight away as you sign up. Theory to Practice is proudly sponsored by counsellingskillsacademy.com. I'm Ken Kelly, and I've got a real burning passion for counselling skills. I've built training that takes the doubt out of using counselling skills. You get to see the counselling skills used in real live sessions by a qualified therapist. Full sessions, real material, real counselling skills. To find out more, go to counsellingskillsacademy.com. That was our theory in practice for today. Moving on now to your practice partner, where we take an element of going into private practice or running a private practice, and we kind of look at that and demystify it. And today we're talking about potentially a dry topic, but I think really important, Rory. I guess you could say it in 4 letters, GDPR, but I think it's more caring to say the collection, storage, and control of the data of our clients that our clients trust to us.
Absolutely, Ken. And this is a topic that comes up in our Facebook page. And if you're not a member of our Facebook page, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, knock on the door. You'll find us. We're a closed group, but our friendly moderators will let you in, and you can join thousands and thousands of like-minded people who are talking about the world of counselling and psychotherapy. We have students, we have qualified colleagues, we have supervisors, we have tutors, all talking about the world of counselling and psychotherapy. And this GDPR is a regular topic, Ken.
It is indeed. And you know, GDPR came in some years ago, and it was a European law. And at the time, Counselling Tutor is based in the United Kingdom, so we're going to speak in that frame of reference. But it doesn't matter where you are in the world, there's going to be a law or legislation that governs how data is collected and stored. And GDPR stood for, or does stand for, General Data Protection Regime or regulations, and that was a European law. But when Brexit came into effect and the UK left the EU, we moved away from the EU GDPR. But what kicked off instantly then was UK GDPR. And that is tailored more specifically to people resident in the UK. And it is mapped to the Data Protection Act of 2018 here in the United Kingdom. So not being in the EU does not exempt us from GDPR. It is something we still need to look to. And I think GDPR can send shivers through the body because it sounds so confusing and it keeps on changing and it's very difficult to keep up to date and understand exactly what's happening. And I think in its simplest form, GDPR, its actual aim is to protect personal data that is shared with us as counsellors. That is it in its simplest form. And I think when we define what is personal data is somebody's name, might be their postal address. It could be a phone number. And I think that's one that maybe slips by, Rory. You know, you might get contacted by a client. Their number may come onto your phone if you have your phone number listed on a directory or if that's your mode of contact. And we might not think that having that person's number on our phone is their data, but it is. And as is their email address, if they send us an email looking to engage in therapy or fill in a form on our website. And any details, of course, that are kept before, during, or after the actual therapeutic process, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give a kind of conceptual idea of why it's important, if we think about the type of information that clients share with us. So, you know, initially it'll be things like phone numbers, maybe maybe their home address. Then, you know, if they become clients of ours, we may have their GP address, we may have their email address, and then we obviously keep clinical notes of our interactions with clients. And those are very, very, very personal pieces of information, which, if they got into the public domain, could be catastrophic for the person concerned and their families and their work. It's just never ending, and that is why we have defined areas of confidentiality in counselling. And GDPR really came into being because we live in an electronic age. In the UK, we used to have the 1998 Data Protection Act, which was really for paper records, and that was generated by the fact that someone was walking on a tip one day in the UK and found a big pile of medical records blowing around a tip with people's personal information on. And people were so outraged about this, and rightly so, that they produced the Data Protection Act. And then it became apparent, in the digital age we live, that information can travel faster. It's harder to erase. Once it's on the internet, it's virtually impossible to get it removed. It becomes replicated, and a more robust law was put in place. And it started in 2016, and now it's 2018. The law became ratified in 2018 as the General Data Protection Regulations. And as Ken said, I think it's really important. It is a very dry subject, but it's an important part of practice. And if you're an independent practitioner, having an understanding of GDPR and your obligations under it is really important. And the people to look at really is the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office. They're based in Wilmslow, just down the road from where I live. There's a website which will pop onto the episode show notes, episode 244, counsellingtutor.com, and have a look at what your obligations are. But generally speaking, any data that a client shares with you, phone numbers, email addresses, GP details, client notes, there are certain aspects of storing information and access of information you have to abide by. And one of those is that a client can access their clinical notes. They can say, I want to see what you've written about me. And you have to produce those within a number of days to your client. It's about transparency, and it's about making sure that any data that is written about you can be corrected, Ken.
100%. And you're speaking about the client having the right to access their notes, because that is data that you have collected maybe before or during or after a session that you have written down. It is their data that you are putting on their account from your time and meeting with them. But they also have the right to request any data from you, including they can say to you, how did you get my information in the first place? Let's say somebody goes onto your website and they fill in a form to say that they're interested in having therapy with you. We have an obligation to track how that information came in, the date that it came in, the fact that person gave us permission to email them back. So just somebody filling in a form and sending it doesn't give us informed permission to send that back. So somebody can ask for any details that you hold on them, including how you got their details in the very first place. So GDPR speaks about lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. We need to identify valid grounds under the GDPR for collecting and using personal data. So we start by asking ourselves, do I really need this person's data? So if somebody makes an inquiry with you and then you try and follow up with that person and that person does not reply and they kind of go away, well then under the GDPR law, we have no right to hold that data anymore. We need to delete it. We need to get rid of that data because that person is we no longer have a valid reason for holding that data. We need to ensure that we don't do anything with the data that it is in breach of any of the laws. And I think this is tricky. I trained more than 10 years ago, and GDPR was not a thing. It wasn't taught within my training. So it's difficult now post-training to learn all these new laws and all of the compliance. But we're called on. It is legislation. We have no choice in this. We have to do it. And then I guess the third one is use the personal data in a way that is fair. And that means that it must not be processed. We can't process the data in any way that would be different to what was expected by the person when they first came in. So an example of that may be we get a client that comes in, they speak to us about a presentation. Perhaps we don't have the level of competence to work with them on that presentation. So maybe we contact a colleague and we say, hey, I've got this client and they fall right into your sweet spot. I know you're an expert in working with XYZ presentation. Here's their information. Well, that is against the law. We cannot share that person's data without their informed consent. We would need to go to the client and say, you've shared this information with me. I have a colleague who has this, and maybe share their data with them. So there's so much to take into consideration. And there's a call. Certainly within Counselling Tutor, all of our staff have to do GDPR training when we start, if we're working with any kind of data. And I guess we need to train ourselves as therapists and understand what all the accountability is, explicit consent, that is the person needing to give us a reason why they are contacting us. And that might be a tick box at the bottom of the form that they fill in that says, I give consent for you to email me back. We have to have that informed, explicit consent, and we need to be able to evidence that we have that. And it can sound terribly confusing. There are tools available online that can help do that, and we in Counselling Tutor recognized that there was much confusion around keeping client data, collecting client data, keeping client data, and storing of client data for counsellors. And we built a tool called Therapy Lock. And Therapy Lock is a GDPR compliant management system that holds, I think we call it our digital vault, Rory. It is a digital vault that is compliant, that keeps client information, details, notes, and it keeps it encrypted. It keeps it double password protected, and it basically keeps us safe and it keeps the clients safe. You can, of course, do this yourself if you do the training, but if you do want an easy way, then pop over to counsellingtutor.com, scroll down, look for Therapy Lock. It's right there on the first page. Therapy Lock, locks up all of your notes, and you can get more information on that. Anything more on GDPR? I know that. We could go on all day on GDPR.
Yeah, one final thing. I'm sure the listener at home is sat now thinking, "Oh dear, this sounds a bit overwhelming, maybe." And what do I do next? Well, the first thing is, not doing anything really isn't an option, because if there is a breach of data protection within your practice and you call to your ethical body, the first thing they'll ask for is your data protection contract and how you manage data protection and how you're registered with the Information Commissioner's Office. And, you need to look at these things. So what I would say is, if you have any issues, go to the ICO here in the UK. Now, in the Republic of Ireland, it is actually called the Data Protection Commission, because I know we have a few listeners in the Republic of Ireland, and hello to you. So it is the Data Protection Commission. They are, of course, in Europe. we sometimes forget. So go to them if you're in the Republic. Sometimes Republic of Ireland, sometimes Southern Ireland. It's referred to. But go to the Data Protection Commission. And if you're in the UK, go to the Information Commissioner's Office website. We'll publish details in the webpage. And if you're unsure, contact them. I've had many, many conversations with the Data Protection Commission in the UK. They're lovely people. They genuinely want to help you. They're not the kind of startsy who's going to look to prosecute you because you've not dotted an I or crossed a T. They genuinely want to help you. And in every single interaction I've had, they have been really thorough, really helpful, and given some really useful guidance. So if you're unsure, and also, your ethical bodies, they provide a lot of information about data protection. So contact your ethical bodies. Again, in my experience, our friends at the National Counselling Society are very, 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 very helpful when it comes to talking about data protection. But if you're unsure, ask, find out, and start to develop and do some CPD around it. But it is now, for independent practitioners, an essential ingredient to your practice.
And we speak about client autonomy, and GDPR really just keys into the rights that our clients have. And the rights of individuals under the GDPR legislation states the following. So they have the right to be informed of what data we have on them, how that was collected, to have access to their data. As we've already mentioned, Rory, they can ask for their notes or indeed any information that we may hold. And then we have a duty to make that available for them, to rectify any information that is held. Something could be incorrect. Maybe a client asks for their notes and they look through their notes and they come back and say, well, that for me was not 100% accurate. It was actually like this. They have a right to rectify what is collected. There is a right to erase or the right to be forgotten. And this is kind of a parallel road here, because there are instances where the storing of the data would fall under other legislations, maybe child protection, or we might have a reason to keep medical records. But generally, a person has a right to be forgotten, a right to say, I don't want you to keep any information on me anymore, please. And then we have a need to get rid of that, to get rid of the data, to restrict processing. It's their right to restrict processing, and the restricting of processing is, how is that data processed? Is it manipulated? Does it go through any channels that they have not agreed with? They have the right to object. They have the right to say, I don't want to hear from you anymore. And that rely in relation to automated decision making and profiling. So kind of the manipulation that is sometimes used by the big companies to profile and collect data. But these are the rights that our clients have, and we are held accountable under law to provide those rights, I guess. So it is a big topic. If you're running a private practice, you are going to be registering with the ICO. You are going to have policies within your organization that govern how you collect, manage, and store the data. I think we've given some great resources in this, Rory, as the ICO.
I think we have. And I think, as Ken and myself always say, or Ken more often says, we're not experts in this area.
Yeah.
Find out for yourself. Certainly client notes fall under what's called special category of data.
Yeah.
And the right to be forgotten may very well not be as straightforward as normal data. So I could have, if I have a phone company, I could ask them to delete my records, but I couldn't ask the NHS to delete my medical records, or the police to delete the odd speeding fine I may have had in the
that
past.
Would be nice.
That would be nice, wouldn't it? Because it falls under special category of data. So get the advice, take action. Don't be afraid of this. It is a process to engage with. There's lots of help out there. And, it isn't a punitive regime. I mean, certainly if your client notes ended up on Facebook, I think you would be in some difficulty, to say the very least. But generally speaking, the ICO and ethical bodies are there to be helpful. They understand this is a complex, difficult, and relatively new piece of legislation. Let's not forget, it's at the time of recording this podcast, I think it's just over 4 years old. So it's a relatively new piece of legislation. So, take all the advice you can. And certainly, as I say, I would leave it with you not to be afraid or nervous. Just engage with it, find out as much as you can, speak to colleagues, speak to ethical bodies, speak to the ICO or whatever regime organization oversees data protection in the country you are, and start, if you've not already, start to develop your data protection policies.
Yeah. And if you want some help with the heavy lifting side of that, go to counsellingtutor.com, scroll down on the homepage, have a look at Therapy Lock. That was built in conjunction with solicitors advising us on the requirements and the law. It is ultra secure and it is ultra compliant. It's GDPR compliant, and I guess holds our clients' data securely. Counsellingtutor.com. All the information is there. That was Practice Partner. And moving out of Practice Partner into Practice Matters, Rory, where you met up with Amy Launder, talking about working with guilt, a massive topic.
It's a massive topic, and it appears in the therapy room more often than not. At some point, it's a universal presentation, I would say. Amy Launder has produced a fantastic lecture that's in our Counsellor Study Resource Library for our students and our CPD Library for qualified colleagues. And it oversees and outlines how to work with guilt, how guilt may appear and present in therapy room, and how we work at it. And Amy Launder is one of our long-time presenters. She's an audience favourite. She just has a way of presenting this information in such a straightforward and easy to digest way that you can finish the lecture and say, this is what I'm going to do, this is how I'm going to work. Absolutely excellent. And I caught up with her to ask a little bit about how guilt appears in the therapy room and what takeaways she hopes that people would take from the lecture. And this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters.
The National Counselling Society is proud to sponsor Practice Matters. National Counselling Society are really excited to have launched their Children and Young People Therapist Register for counsellors working with the younger age group. To find out more, visit nationalcounselingsociety.org. nationalcounselingsociety.org.
And we welcome back Amy Launder, who is one of our favourite presenters. The audience in our CPD and CSR library love your presentations. So first of all, Amy Launder, welcome.
Thank you for having me back.
Always a joy. And you've actually done another lecture on working with shame and guilt.
Yes, I have, yeah.
Now, shame and guilt is something that appears often in my experience in the therapy room. I wonder how a therapist might immediately see it or be able to pick up that a client is feeling feelings of shame or feelings of guilt without them actually vocalizing it.
Yeah, well, I think one of the main kind of outward symptoms, I guess, or signs is the kind of constant self-blame or putting oneself down, or just kind of taking on the blame for things that maybe they shouldn't do, or that it's not appropriate for them to take on the blame for. Like, for example, the fact that their friend didn't get a job. It's not their responsibility to help their friend get a job, but they feel guilty that their friend didn't pass the interview or whatever it was.
Yeah, and maybe something along the lines of I wasn't a good enough friend. They asked for some advice, and I didn't give them the right advice. And I also think, and I don't know if this has been the start again in 5, 4, 3. And I don't know if this has been your experience as a therapist, but sometimes adults carry a lot of guilt and shame from their childhood.
Yeah, I think a lot of our guilt and shame comes from our experiences in childhood. I mean, in the lecture and presentation, I was talking about Alan Shaw, who believed that, we use shame as a parenting technique, not necessarily in a bad way, but, shame has a parasympathetic effect on the body. So it kind of dampens whatever you were going to do, whatever action you were about to take, it kind of sucks the energy out of you, shame does. So, if a child is about to run in the road and parent shouts, it's kind of shame, I shouldn't have been doing that. And they kind of back away, or, climbing up the cupboard or whatever it was. And the child feels shame and they stop the behaviour. But for most people, that is the extent of it. And then, the child is soothed and it's explained why they can't do the thing they're about to do and that kind of thing. For some families, it's used as a parenting technique just to kind of keep children quiet and out of the way and out of trouble. And so it's not really explained away. It's used quite excessively in some families.
Yes, and certainly as a child of the 60s, I can say that shame and guilt were not only parental introjects, they were societal introjects. Thankfully, we live in a more open and thoughtful society now. But certainly, friends of mine who had strong religious backgrounds may have felt at the time, and I'm sure that, faith positions and the people who, profess within faith positions have, altered the way they work now. But certainly there was a lot of shame from friends of mine who went to, into the religious aspects of maybe education or their churches. And that could carry through. It's a very strong message, isn't it, for children, I think?
Definitely, because shame runs deeper than guilt does. Shame is essentially, I'm a bad person, whereas guilt is, I've done a bad thing. So it can be much more kind of fleeting than shame, where, shame cuts right down to who we are at our core, that, we're inadequate, we're not good enough, we're inherently bad because of something that we believe or something that we do or just the way that we are. And so that sticks with us for much longer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, isn't it? It's more kind of embedded into the psyche. Mm-hmm. And I guess that shame and guilt could come from a lot of aspects. I mean, I've worked with a lot of clients who've been ashamed about their sexuality or ashamed about their sexual preferences, shall we say. Is that something that comes up in your practice?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it kind of goes back to your point of it comes from society as well, or it comes from, I guess it depends who is around you at the time, where, what's your family like, what's your religion like, your friends, your school, all of those kind of things. Are they accepting of your sexuality or, whatever it is that you're feeling shame about? And the likely answer is at least one of them isn't, and that's where the shame has come from. So I would say it's generally not just inherently because of a certain sexuality or something like that. It's other people's reaction to it and us internalizing that.
Yeah. Oh, and I think that's shame and guilt in general, isn't it? About how external, Rogers would say the external locus of evaluation, but that how our friends, our families, society in general see what we do and how we behave can generate huge amounts of guilt and shame. So as therapists, how do we work with guilt and shame? How do we engage with the client who's maybe too frightened or too ashamed or too guilty to even speak about the issue they're ashamed or guilty about?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I would normally do is try to distinguish with the client, is it guilt or is it shame? Or is it a combination of both? Is it that kind of, I've done a bad thing, therefore I'm a bad person? Generally, it's one or the other, and clients tend to feel ashamed, or say they feel ashamed, whereas actually maybe they feel guilty for a particular thing. So distinguishing between the two can always be really helpful. And then another thing is kind of reframing the shame or the guilt. Because I think a lot of people feel they need to keep punishing themselves for whatever it is they think they have done or that they have actually done. They need to keep punishing themselves forever. Whereas actually that's not necessarily the case. And a good question can sometimes be, it's a bit of a funny question, or it's, kind of shocks people out of that seriousness, kind of going, well, if you had been caught and arrested for the thing that you've done, how long would your sentence have been? And the likely answer is that they have surpassed that sentence multiple times and they're still punishing themselves. And so kind of putting it into context a bit.
I think I like that intervention. The fact that you're comparing what society may deem as a sufficient punishment for the act done and the self-inflicted punishment from the person. I think that's a really, really useful intervention. I've just written that down. I'm certainly going to be using that. So that's my takeaway for today. And I think it's also about framing. So, I mean, many years ago, I had an acquaintance who wanted to speak to me about something they were terribly ashamed about. And without going into too much detail, I remember saying to this person, well, what you had was a traumatic reaction to something. And you responded in a way that would keep you alive. And it was amazing just to see you could physically see the weight lift off their shoulders when they realised that actually what they did was a life-saving activity. Is that something that you have ever seen in your practice?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, actually. And one I would have forgotten to bring up is the reframing and normalising a lot of the things that people feel ashamed about. Even shame itself, if someone grew up in an abusive household, feeling shame was actually your body's kind of survival tactic, because it keeps you docile and it keeps you out of the way even of the abusive parent. So it's a survival tactic in itself. Or even the kind of fight, flight, freeze. A lot of people feel ashamed for having frozen, rather, in an assault or something like that, rather than fighting or fleeing. And actually normalizing that you don't have any choice over that. That's your body's reaction to it. And, so if you have no choice over it, we shouldn't feel ashamed about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is amazing just how much guilt and shame there is in society. You only have to, listen on the TV. Sometimes when you're hearing someone being interviewed, or even in conversations with friends and relatives, it does come up a lot. It's almost like it's a default position when people think they haven't done the right thing.
Yeah, and I think we do, or a lot of people do have that kind of black and white, all or nothing thinking of either they're perfect or they should be ashamed of themselves. But shame and guilt can be useful as well. Like, I don't know if you've seen or heard of the program Shameless. The people in that program are completely, narcissistic, anything to win and that kind of thing, and it doesn't matter who they hurt, because they have no shame about what they're doing. And so shame and guilt are useful. They link to our morals. They let us know when we have done something wrong. But it's when we hold on to it all for too long that it becomes problematic, or when it's inappropriate to feel the shame, it becomes more problematic. But there is such a thing as healthy guilt or clean guilt as well.
Yes, I think that's very interesting. And Shameless was filmed. It was filmed in Manchester, and certainly I think one of the things I took away from that is that some people were shameless because of the circumstances they found themselves in. They were just trying to make the best of a bad situation, and it's a bit of a parable for our times. There's lots of shameless people that we see quite regularly on the TV. I won't say any more than that. But yes, that idea that it's a way of surviving, and people own their own shame. I've had that certainly in my practice. Is that something you've experienced?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's definitely been, people who they know they've done something wrong, they feel ashamed about it, and they use that to, you recognize you've done something wrong, make amends with the person, and then let go of it. But owning it and knowing that you've done something wrong is really important. I think when we try and bury it, when that's like a hidden part of ourselves, the shadow part of ourselves, that it then gets entangled in everything that we do from then on. And that's when it becomes very problematic. But owning it and, acknowledging it can be very helpful.
It is. And I guess as a therapist that sometimes we can't escape the dreaded transference, where maybe all the parallel process in some cases, where someone talks about something they've done and we've done exactly the same thing. And I think that's an interesting process. And I think for me, that's one to take maybe to supervision if you feel that you don't know whose guilt or shame it is.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. And sometimes, a client might be talking about something that you would feel ashamed of, but they don't, or vice versa, and trying to unpick all of that can be really interesting, yeah. Or if you suddenly, as a therapist, I guess, feel a sense of shame and you don't know why, has that come from the client and it's just not been spoken about?
Yes, I think it's really, really interesting, and I think that this is a timely lecture because shame and guilt do appear in the therapy room a lot. It is a recurring theme. So finally, Amy, what do you hope that people will take away from your lecture?
I mean, for me, the key message, the kind of basis of this is the difference between guilt and shame, and being able to differentiate it with your clients so that they're not globalizing guilt into shame when it's not really necessary. I think that would be the key takeaway for me.
Well, I think on those wise words, Amy Launder, thank you so much for joining us.
As always, a massive thank you to Amy Launder. A big thank you to you, Rory, for hosting that interview. Lots of really interesting information there, something that definitely comes up in the therapy room again and again and again. As Rory said going into this, the full lecture is available. If you're a student, it is available in our Counselling Study Resource Library. If you're a qualified practitioner, the full session on Amy Launder, Working with Guilt, is available in the Counsellor CPD library. If you're not a member of those libraries, either the student library or the qualified library, go to counsellingtutor.com. All the information is there. And of course, Rory, this has been episode 244 of the Counselling Tutor podcast.
Yes, we started with theory and practice, developing your internal supervisor, your therapeutic conscience, which speaks to you and directs to some extent what you'd speak it about in supervision. We moved on to practice partner and the thorny and sometimes difficult issue of UK general data protection regulations, where we looked at an overview of GDPR and your obligations under it and some takeaways of what you might want to do having listened. And then finally in Practice Matters, we caught up with the wonderful Amy Launder, who spoke about guilt in an interview that I conducted with her for a lecture she has produced for the CSR Library, the Counsellor Study Resource Library, and our CPD Library. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.